My name is Jay Harbison. Today is Thursday, February the 16th of 2023. We are at the Nashville Bar Association in downtown Nashville. This interview is being conducted for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. And before we get started, I did also want to say that really the main reason that we're here today is because of Carol McCoy.
Yes.
Who I ran into at an event a couple weeks ago, and she said, "Hey Jay, why has your dad not done the Legal History Project for the NBA yet?" And you and I engaged in a conversation with her, and here we are.
Yes, thanks to Carol.
Thanks to Carol. So thank you, Carol. All right, I have some questions that I'm going to go through with you. You've obviously seen them, and I think this will be super fun. So let's start with your full name.
Okay. I'm your father,
You are my father.
and my name is William Leslie Harbison.
And what's your birthday and where were you born?
I was born on November 4, 1954 at Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville.
So I want to get some, history from you about your family. So let's start with your four grandparents. Why don't you kind of go through them?
Okay. Well, my father's father was a lawyer in Columbia, Tennessee. He became a lawyer in 1911. Practiced in Columbia the rest of his life. He died in 1953. And his wife, my grandmother, Eunice Harbison, was in my life a lot. And so that was, grew up with her, going to Columbia, going to her farm that was in Water Valley, Tennessee, which is outside of Santa Fe, Tennessee. So those were my paternal grandparents. And then my mother grew up in Salisbury, North Carolina, where her mother lived again during my lifetime, and I knew her very well. My mother's father had died before I was born. His name was Earl C. Coleman.
What did he do for a living?
He was a minister, Presbyterian minister.
And so you grew up. Tell me about going down to Columbia to visit your grandmother as a child.
So we went almost every Sunday to Columbia. My father lived in Nashville and practiced law in Nashville. My parents did. And so I grew up here in Nashville. But we would go pretty much every Sunday to my grandmother's house in Columbia, which was in town, where she would have lunch for us, always a really elaborate lunch on Sunday. And then after lunch, we would go down to the farm, which was maybe 20 minutes away in the country.
And what would you do at the farm?
And at the farm, we would walk around and look at the fields, look at the cows. When I was really little, there were sheep. And I think my father would talk with the man, Buddy Dodson, who ran the farm. He and his family lived on the farm. And so I was friends with their children, with Buddy and Elizabeth's children. And we would actually go to the barn and play and find eggs that the chickens had laid and things like that. So it was pretty idyllic.
Did they grow tobacco?
They did every year. In fact, I think that was probably what my grandmother lived on.
Was the money from the
money
tobacco?
from tobacco. They did raise cattle and sheep and other things too, but I think the tobacco was probably the biggest crop. And they had a tobacco barn where it would dry. They would harvest it and hang it up in the barn and smoke it, and it would dry.
And it smells good.
And it smelled really good. And that's a smell I remember. I will always remember.
And weren't you given a cow at one point?
My grandmother Yoon gave me a cow, gave me and my sister each a cow. It was a calf, and we knew which one it was. And eventually it grew up and was sold, and we somehow got the money from the sale, which seemed like a lot of money, like maybe $200.
And what year would that have been?
That would have been in the 60s, probably the early to mid 60s.
So it was a lot of money.
At the time, it seemed like it. I don't know what I did with it.
I was going to ask. Or spend it on junk.
I probably did.
And Buddy was kind of your childhood hero, right?
Buddy, I admired so much. He was a really wonderful man. He worked on the farm. He ran the farm and lived in the house that was on the farm, which had been my grandmother's childhood home.
She was born there, right?
She was born there on the farm, and her family had owned that farm since the early 1800s. So it was really a long time. And Buddy ran the farm. He also worked at Monsanto, which was in the area, plant in the area. So he was a busy guy, but he was a remarkable man and really, really nice to me. He was an important figure to me.
And you told me before that when you were a kid, you wanted to grow up and be just like Buddy and ride a tractor and smoke cigarettes.
Those were my two ambitions. Not only ride a tractor, but to drive the tractor.
Drive the tractor while smoking.
And smoke a cigarette.
Uh-huh.
Yes, because Buddy did both of those things.
Probably smoked a lot.
I think he probably did.
And so you grew up here in Nashville, right?
Yes.
And so tell us about kind of your early years, like through elementary school, where you lived and, who you were friends with and that kind of thing.
We lived at 852 Pasadena Drive, which was in Oak Hill section of Nashville. And Glendale Elementary School was within walking distance of our house. So I was lucky enough to go to Glendale the first 6 years of school, first through sixth grade. And I could most days walk to school very easily. So we would cut through yards and walk to school. There were a lot of other kids that lived in the neighborhood. So
Yeah, the baby boomers.
we were the baby boomers, and there were lots of us. And there would be tree houses in the neighborhood where we would go and read comic books and so forth, spend the night. There was just a really good group of kids that we would play hide and seek at night, kick the can. It was a fun neighborhood.
And, of course, I know the answer to some of these questions already, but who are some people that you went to elementary school with? I mean, I know you're still friends with plenty of them.
Yes, I am.
But ones who are lawyers here today.
Ones who are still lawyers. Frank Clement was the son of the governor at the time, and we were real near the governor's mansion. So Frank, I think, went to Glendale. He was a couple of years older than I was, but we still talk about those times. In fact, on Halloween, we would go to the governor's mansion and they would hand out giant Hershey bars, more than you would typically get when you went trick-or-treating. His longtime partner, Drew Gibson, went to Glendale Elementary School, and I'm still in touch with him. So I'm trying to remember, don't know if I can remember other kids who became lawyers right this minute.
Paul DeWitt.
Well, I grew up with Paul. Paul didn't go to Glendale.
Oh, I thought he did.
Paul went to kindergarten with me.
Okay. You went to kindergarten somewhere else.
I went to kindergarten at Belmont Methodist Church, which was the church we belonged to and where I still belong. And my parents belonged there. And they had unusual at the time in the 50s. There really weren't a lot of kindergartens. There certainly weren't public kindergarten. And so I went to kindergarten at Belmont, and I am still close friends with Paul DeWitt, who was at that kindergarten. And then I was later in high school with Paul. He's my age.
So I want to go back a little bit and talk about, the long line of lawyers in our family.
Mm-hmm.
You already talked about your grandfather being a
Yes.
lawyer in Columbia, and
Yes.
he was what was been described to me as a kind of a town square lawyer. Is that?
Yeah, he had an office. I don't remember this because he died the year before I was born. But I've learned about it, and he rented a space on the square right across from the courthouse. Somewhere we have a picture of him in his office,
I
in a
have
big chair. You have that picture, which is good. And
There's a picture, there's a map of the state of Tennessee on the wall and a portrait of,
Henry Clay.
no, it's not Henry Clay, it's Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt. Well, he was a big reader. My grandfather, I know because their house was full of books.
He still
And
has it.
I still have most of those books. And I do know that the picture of the lithograph of Henry Clay that hangs in our house now was in his law office. I'm not telling for how long.
A portrait of Henry Clay that I think most of the women in our family have have no desire to have hung on the wall.
right. My father took it after my grandmother died, and it hung in our den, in their den, and then now it's in my house.
And do you know what kind of work your grandfather did?
Yeah, it was a small town law practice. He did deeds and wills and mortgages. It was mostly, I think, an office practice. He occasionally, I think, had a case in court. I don't think that was mostly what he did, to tell you the truth. I know that occasionally he would associate a Nashville law firm. I'm told Cecil Sims was one of the people he associated with a little bit, and Charles Trabue, who I later worked for many years later.
You told me before that at one point, and we'll get to your career in a little bit here, but that I'm not going to get this quite right, but you had a client that had been your grandfather's client.
Yes, Jimmy Attrell.
So tell me about that.
So Jimmy Attrell was a Nashville guy who, his son is still a friend of mine. His father had grown up in Columbia and had been a client of my grandfather's. And years later, when I started practicing law, Jimmy still owned that building in Columbia, and I did a little bit of work for him with regard to that building. I can't remember what exactly, maybe we sold it. And but the connection was nice because he remembered my grandfather.
So had your grandfather maybe done the deed or something?
Yes, he had done the deed. I do remember that.
So you worked on a case or a transaction with a deed written by your grandfather?
Yes, I did.
Did you know that beforehand, or did you discover it?
He told me.
He told
Me about it. And then, of course, I looked at the documents and saw that it was my grandfather's work.
And so let's talk about your father for a little bit here, because none of us would be here without him.
That's right.
What was his name?
He was William J. Harbison, William James Harbison.
And I'm obviously named after
you
him.
You are William James Harbison II.
And he was born in Columbia.
Right. He was born on 3rd Avenue in Columbia, at home. He was born at home.
In the house he used to go visit.
In the house that I would go visit, that was my grandmother's house.
And what was his birthday?
And he was born on September 11, 1923.
So if he were still living, he would be turning 100. He'd be 100 this year.
Yeah.
And I know a little bit about this just from you, but it sounds like he had a pretty good childhood.
My father had a wonderful childhood. He was very close to his sister Frances, who was my aunt and was there for my whole life.
A couple years older than him, right?
She was 6 years older than he was, which is a pretty big age difference. And she told me she remembered when he was born, and but they were very close siblings.
And there had been another child before her.
Yes.
That died, but how
his
old?
name was Jeff. It was William Jefferson. No, sorry. Yeah, William Jefferson Harbison. And
so another WJ.
He was another WJ. And my grandfather was William Joshua Harbison. So everybody was WJ Harbison except for me. And I was actually named after a favorite uncle of my father's, Leslie Kinzer.
And so Jeff was the firstborn child of your
He was, and he got sick when he was 2 years old and sadly died. And that was before the other children came along. And so when my father was born,
you know where I'm going with this.
I know where I'm going to go ahead and tell you what that story is, because when my father was born, his parents, I think, were still affected, I'm sure, by the death of their younger son and older son. And so they just called my father WJ, and all he had were initials. So my grandmother always called him WJ. That was his name. And I haven't seen his birth certificate, but I suspect that's what's on it, just initials, because they didn't want to ascribe the William and then some middle name to it.
And so when did the William James come in?
So he was drafted into the Army in World War II in 1943. My father was at Vanderbilt as an undergraduate at that time, and he was drafted into the Army. And when he was drafted, they said you can't be just initials, you have to have a name. And so he made up William James, and the rest of his life he was known as William James Harbison.
And he had tried to enlist before that, right?
He had tried to enlist probably the year before and was told they didn't need him because he had flat feet, and which I inherited.
But then as the war progressed, they
needed more people.
They needed more people.
They needed more people, and things changed. By 1943, they were happy to have him.
And so, when I say he had a good childhood, obviously he grew up during the Depression.
Yeah, it was a terrible time for everybody, from what I understand. And I'm sure they didn't have a lot, but they did have a farm.
His father was a lawyer.
His father was a lawyer, and he played baseball on a team. He had a lot of friends there in Columbia. He went to public school in Columbia, graduated from Central High School in Columbia. He was the valedictorian of his class.
And we know from a photo somewhere that he was only the salutatorian of the 8th grade.
In the 8th grade, he was only the salutatorian, and I'm sure they were very disappointed.
And then so then he went to Vanderbilt, and then
Yeah.
stopped partway through to serve, and then came back and finished, right?
Yeah, my father told me that he came back from the war, and I'm not sure exactly what year that was. He was part of the troops that occupied Germany after they surrendered. And so he was in Germany for a good while and actually got to travel around Germany a lot. I know he went to Munich and he went skiing in the Alps, and he enjoyed, I think, to the extent it was a bad time, but he enjoyed seeing Germany. And when he came back to this country, he and a friend from the Army had a plan that they would get a car and drive around the United States and see the whole country. And apparently my grandfather said, "No, you're not going to do that. I've already enrolled you back in Vanderbilt, and you're going back."
And you're going back.
Yeah, and he did.
We've got some letters in our family, where your father is at Vanderbilt writing to your grandfather in Columbia,
Yes.
Saying, "Hey, Dad,
Can I have some money?
Can you send me $20?"
That's right. That was
We've all done that.
we've all done that. I did that for you.
Yes, you did.
And so that was definitely those letters are fun to still have. And I think my grandfather did send him $20 from time to
I'm
time.
sure he did.
Yeah.
And then your father obviously went to Vanderbilt Law School. Well, he graduated from Vanderbilt.
He graduated from Vanderbilt, where he was founders medalist, #1 in his class as an undergraduate. He had majored in history and English. And he went straight to law school after that and finished law school in 1950, which was a really wonderful class of people who became lawyers in Nashville. A lot of them stayed in Nashville.
Name some of them for us.
Mac Davis just passed away and died. Whitney Stiegel was a chancellor in Murfreesboro. Connie Summers is still living at age 102. I think he might be the last person from that class. A really good friend of my father's was A.B. Neal, who was a longtime lawyer in Nashville and became the appellate court clerk later in his life. Lots of friends from that class.
Well, and just so we get it down in the recording, he was also first in his class in law school.
He was first in his class in law school as well.
And tell the story about him taking the bar exam.
So, and of course, I wasn't there. I wasn't born yet, but the story about my father is that he sat for the bar exam in 1950, and the bar examiners called up the dean of the Vanderbilt Law School to say that they were sorry to report that one of their students had been cheating. The dean of Vanderbilt Law School was John Wade, who was himself a wonderful scholar, prolific writer, important legal scholar. And they called Dean Wade to say, "We're sorry to say one of your students has been cheating on the exam. He's not only citing cases in his answers, but he's giving pinpoint cites to specific parts of cases. And we know he must be cheating." And Dean Wade said, "Who is it?" And they told him, and Dean Wade's answer was, he's been doing that for 3 years and he's not cheating. And so he went on to become a lawyer.
I mean, he had, if not a complete photographic memory, a pretty close one.
It was close to that. It was close to that. He could cite cases. He remembered.
Did he claim to have a photographic memory?
No, he never. He was a really modest person, really modest person. And he would never claim to have any special talent, but it's just the fact that he was always number one in everything he took. And he was a great scholar, a great writer.
Well, so I want to go back to your, I think it was important to hear stuff about your dad, and I'm sure we'll go back to him in a minute, but
Yeah.
I want to close the loop on your, education. So you went to
I
Glendale,
went to Glendale for 6 years.
and then where did you
And
go?
then I went to MBA, Montgomery Bell Academy. I started there in 1967 and graduated in 1973. And so I only went to 2 schools, Glendale and MBA.
And you were first in your class at MBA.
I was valedictorian of my class at MBA. Yes, I was. Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. And then your sister, who was 1 year younger,
She was 18 months younger.
but only 1 year behind you in school.
Right. She was
Right.
only a year behind me. So I graduated in 73. She graduated from Harbison in 1974.
And what was her class rank?
And she was number 1 in her class at Harbison.
For the record, this all stopped with their generation. This streak ended.
Not so
in
much.
the 70s. And so when you were in high school, who were your close friends? What did you do for summer jobs?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
So, yeah. So, I am lucky that I still have extraordinarily close friends that I was in high school with. Mark Kelly and I, my first job was being a stock boy at Harvey's department store, and that was when I was 16. I worked there for the summer, and when I got my job there, Mark was really one of my best friends, and he got a job there too. So we were stock boys together at Harvey's, and I guess that would have been 1971, I think. And then I worked at Harvey's for the next summers until I went to college.
And Harvey's was here in downtown now.
Harvey's was a department store in Nashville, but I worked at the 100 Oaks store, which was new. Yeah, I went to the 100 Oaks store.
And what would you guys do to goof off and slack off at work?
So when we were at work, we would get in the freight elevator and ride it halfway up and then stop it, and then nobody knew where we were. So that was, but we would get paged all the time, and we would have to go to this part of the store, or that part of the store,
Do you remember the code?
and get stuff. Yes, it was 6-5. And the page would say 6-5, come to the ladies department. And that meant us, and we would kind of take turns responding to those pages.
Sometimes it meant that there was a mess you had to clean up.
It sometimes meant that somebody had thrown up in the ladies department or something like that. And the
Y'all
stock boy-
were the low guys on the totem
we
pole.
were the lowest of the low. So whatever terrible job there was, I mean, we also unpacked furniture and unpacked boxes and did the trash and things like that, but we also had to respond when there was something wrong.
And so after you graduated high school in 1973, where'd you go to college?
So I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
And why did you decide to go there?
And I went there because my grandmother was in Salisbury. I had visited the campus. I think anybody who's visited the campus of UNC falls in love with it. It's a really beautiful place. It's a very large university. But I had grown up visiting that area. I had an uncle that lived in Greensboro, North Carolina. He was still there when I was in college, and my grandmother was still in Salisbury the whole time I was in college. So I had the opportunity to go and stay with her, visit with her, visit with my uncle.
Did you ever consider going anywhere else?
Not seriously. I applied for early admission at UNC and got in the fall of, I guess it would be 1972.
So you never applied anywhere else?
I don't remember that I even did, because I got early.
You got in. I
admission.
mean, it was like, I've been saying,
When
same for
you
me.
did for Middlebury.
Yeah. And so, and there were you'll know the number, but there were a bunch of guys from your class at MBA who went to UNC with
There
you.
were about 10, which is remarkable because our class was only about 70 boys. And 10 of us went to UNC to college and we're still friends with most of them.
And tell me about some kind of influential classes or teachers that you had at UNC.
At UNC, I was an English major at UNC, and I had I loved all my English professors, but two really stand out. One was named Albert Strauss. I had him as a freshman, and then I had him for several other courses. He seemed old to me at the time. He was probably 55 or so. I'm not sure. He might have been a little older than you are now, but he was single. He had grown up in Germany. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power, he was 12. And his parents sent him to England. They realized what was happening. He was Jewish, from a Jewish family in Germany. And they sent him to England.
So they must have had some means, I suppose.
They had some means, and they sent him to boarding school in England. And he never went back to Germany to live. His parents somehow escaped Germany and ended up in Louisiana. And so Dr. Strauss, he was a PhD in English from Harvard, I think. And but during the war, he was, of course, old enough he had moved to this country by the time the war happened, and he was in the U.S. military and
As a native German.
And a German speaker. So I think he was part of maybe intelligence forces, and then he went on to an academic career. He was very influential to me.
Was he the one that served you green chartreuse?
No, that was Dr. Kirkpatrick.
Okay.
Robert Kirkpatrick was the other one. And Dr. Kirkpatrick was another Harvard-educated English professor who taught Romantic poetry and among other things. And I was in some small seminars with him, small meaning like 6 people in a class. He went on to be my advisor on my honors thesis.
Which was about what?
Which was about William Blake. And he was a scholar of the Romantic poets. And one of the people we studied was Wordsworth, who had written about part of the prelude. His prelude is called Stanzas from the Grand Chartreuse. And Dr. Kirkpatrick introduced us to green chartreuse, which is a liqueur that I have liked ever since then.
You've as long as I can remember, you've always had a bottle.
I've always had a bottle. It takes a really long time to drink a bottle of green chartreuse.
That's because it's
probably about 20 years.
It's because it's terrible.
I really like it.
Yeah,
it's good.
And so you graduated from UNC in 77.
1977, yes.
And then what did you do?
So when I was a senior at UNC, I had to decide what was next. And
well, let me back up a second. At one point, you told me before that you had considered a career in academia.
I did. So I really liked these and other English professors so much
that you thought that's what you wanted
that
to
I
do.
thought maybe that would be something I would like to do, to be an English professor. And I talked to a number of them. And of course, this is, the people who had been my parents' age were all still in the prime of their careers in the 70s and had many years to go. And the impression that I got was that there was not a lot of room to become, to go to the top of that profession, at least not very quickly. And that it would be a really long road and really might not be a lot of opportunity because of the many people who were already in place.
And I know sometimes in academia, you don't really necessarily always get a choice about where you end up.
No, and you don't get a choice about where you end up. And so I thought about that a lot, and I made the decision to go to law school. Of course, I had grown up in a family, that was involved in the legal world. And so, and I was very close to my father. And so I applied to law school when I was a senior in college, and then went straight from college to law school.
And tell me about the letter.
Let's see. So when I took the LSAT,
Yeah,
so I took the LSAT and did pretty well. I don't remember what I scored. It was a different scoring
I
system.
think mom claims that she did better than you.
She says that. We'll get to that. But I did well enough, and the letter came to my parents' house in Nashville, and my father opened it and sent me a letter.
Forwarded it to you or what?
Forwarded it to me with a letter from him that said, "This is a really good score. I think it's good enough to get into Vanderbilt, and you can go to Vanderbilt Law School." And so that's what his letter to me said.
But you decided not to go to Vanderbilt.
So I applied to 2 law schools. I applied to Vanderbilt and Harvard,
And you got into both,
and I got into both.
and you picked Harvard.
I picked Harvard, and my friends all said, "You're only going to Harvard to escape the pressure," because my father was sort of a legend at Vanderbilt Law School and still taught a class at Vanderbilt Law School. He taught there his whole career from 1950 until he died in 1993.
What classes did he teach at Vanderbilt?
His main course was something called Tennessee Practice and Procedure, which was a trial advocacy course. But he also taught professional responsibility, torts. He taught a variety.
I didn't know he taught torts.
He did.
And I've heard from, plenty of lawyers, maybe a little older than you, who had him obviously. And I think a lot of them have told me that they had him for what essentially is now civil procedure.
Yeah, so Tennessee Practice and Procedure was a lot like what civil procedure is now.
Because that was before the rules.
Right. My father was chair of the committee that adopted the Tennessee Rules of Civil Procedure, which were modeled on the federal rules, which I think came in 1938 or something like that.
The federal
The
rules.
federal rules did, but Tennessee did not have rules of civil procedure until I think maybe 1968.
I think that's about right.
And my father had been involved in drafting and adopting those rules.
And this is a question that I actually don't know the answer to, prior to the adoption of the Tennessee rules of civil procedure, was it just common law?
Yeah, and when you want
Like when you want to amend your pleading or
right,
whatever.
well, you would still file complaints and answers and things like that, as I understand it, this before my time. But if you were moving to dismiss a case, for example, you didn't file a motion to dismiss, you filed something called a demur.
Demur, yeah.
And there were lots of words like that and sort of ancient practices.
Those
like
cases
that.
can be hard to read sometimes.
They are hard to read, right? And so I think my father was involved really in modernizing civil procedure in Tennessee.
And so you started at Harvard Law in the fall of 1977.
Yes.
And who was your roommate?
And my roommate was randomly assigned. We were in an old dormitory on the campus of Harvard Law School called Hastings Hall. And my roommate was a guy from Alabama named Lee Baines.
Do you think that was a coincidence?
I don't think it was a coincidence. I think they put the 2 Southern kids in a room together, and
You weren't the only two, so.
we were not the only, but it was a minority.
Because another one of your classmates, both at UNC and at Harvard Law School, was who?
Was Jim Cooper. Jim was actually not a classmate at UNC. He did a Rhodes Scholarship.
Oh, that's right.
So he had he was a little bit ahead of me at UNC, but then when we started at Harvard, he was one of the other people from Tennessee in our class at Harvard Law School.
Were there any others besides the two? of
And
you?
Jim McElroy was another who was from Camden, Tennessee. Jim was from Shelbyville. And we met each other almost immediately and became close friends in law school.
So you and Lee Baines lived together.
All 3 years of law school.
Mhm.
He was my roommate all 3 years.
And your first year dorm, it was on campus living, right?
It was.
And it had a, well, tell me about kind of the layout there, because I think that's a
Well,
fun-
it was a really luxurious, it was a really old dormitory, more than 100 years old, I think from the 1800s. And you lived in a suite, which had a living room with a fireplace and a window seat. And then off of that living room were 2 really small bedrooms. So Lee and I had one of those suites that we shared. And there would be maybe, I don't know, several of those small suites on a floor, and they would share a bathroom.
So you didn't have a bathroom in your
We
suite?
did not have a bathroom in our suite, but we had a fireplace.
Where did you eat?
Well, we ate on campus a lot. There was a student union kind of building that was really close by, called Harkness Commons, which we called the Hark. And they had a cafeteria, and that we would eat a lot of meals there. But we also went into Cambridge and there was a place called Elsie's Delicatessen that is gone now, but was famous back then, and we went there a lot.
So tell me about some of your favorite professors or courses in law school.
In law school, I was lucky to really love law school. So
Me too.
yeah, when I was a first year student, my Harvard at that time had 4 sections of students and 800 students. So each section was 150 people, and
All in one class.
all in one.
So
enormous
big lectures.
lecture, theater style classroom. And my contracts professor was a man named Clark Bice, who was the person that everyone said Professor Kingsfield from the Paper Chase had been modeled after. He had also been a character in the book 1L by Scott Turow, which came out the summer before I went to law school.
So if you want to learn about your law school experience, read.
Watch Paper Chase and read 1L.
Yeah,
And so those were both things from the 70s that were just very shortly before I went to law school.
and about Harvard.
And they were both set at Harvard.
Yeah. And who did you have for constitutional?
So, and that was another
Yeah.
really influential time for me. Was my constitutional law professor was Archibald Cox.
Well, and the decade kind of before, 15 years before you went to law school, was a time of immense change.
It was a
obviously,
huge,
especially in the constitutional law.
yes, it was hugely
Warren Court.
controversial and yeah. So Archibald Cox had been named Solicitor General of the United States by John Kennedy in the early 60s, and he had argued many of the really significant Warren Court cases. And so,
Can you remember which one, any specifically?
I think he was probably, I'm sure he was in Gideon versus Wainwright, about the right to counsel.
Mhm.
I'm sure he was in, I think maybe Griswold v. Connecticut about the right to privacy. So when we talked about those cases from the Warren Court years, he knew what had happened in those cases.
Because he had been there.
He had been there. He had been involved, and then of course he had been special prosecutor in the Watergate crisis, and famously fired by Richard Nixon in what was called the Saturday Night Massacre. And all of that was just a few years before I had him for constitutional law. So he was a amazing scholar, but also had just amazing experience with what had happened at the Supreme Court. So he was a big influence on me.
And what did you do for your summers in law school?
So the summer after my first year of law school, I came back home to Nashville and worked at a firm called Trabue, Sturdivant, and DeWitt, which had been my father's law firm before my father became a member of the Tennessee Supreme Court.
And what year did he go on the court?
He went on the court, well, first in 1966, he was appointed to replace a Justice White, who was ill. So he was actually on the court for a year in 1966. And then
Do you remember that?
I do remember that. And then he went back to private practice. And then in 1974, the State Democratic Party, many people were involved in an effort to, they called it, elect a great Supreme Court. Later Judge Gil Merritt was one of the people involved in that effort. Tom Wiseman, who became,
Gil Merritt talked to me about that quite a
and
bit.
I'm sure Gil Merritt remembered that very vividly, and a lot of people still remember it who are still alive.
Yeah.
But my father was one of 5 people who were nominated to become members of the state Supreme
And
Court.
they replaced the whole court.
And they replaced the entire court in 1974 with an entirely new slate of judges, and my father was one of those.
So that happened while you were in college.
That happened while I was in college, and I went and watched the hearings, and that's that summer of 1974. And so my father had been a partner at a firm that had been called Trabue, Sturdivant, and Harbison. Later, it was Trabue, Minnick, Sturdivant, and Harbison. And then when my father went on the court in 1974, the name became Trabue, Sturdivant, and DeWitt, which was Ward DeWitt, who was the father of Paul DeWitt, one of my close friends.
We were talking about a minute ago.
Yeah.
It's so, here's a question I don't think I've ever asked you before. And I know this. So, when you started at Harvard Law School in 1977, your father's on the Tennessee
He's a
Supreme
member of the court at that time.
What was that like?
It was wonderful. He would talk to me about cases that were coming before the court. Back in those, we didn't talk on the phone very much back in those days because long distance was really expensive, but we did write letters. And then when I was home, he would talk to me about what the court was doing. They were I think, very progressive, reform-minded court, and reformed a lot of
Short opinions.
very short opinion. My father liked. He always said it was harder to write a short opinion than it was to write a long opinion.
Judge Merritt said the same.
And he really worked on his opinions. He wrote hundreds.
And he wrote them himself, right?
And he wrote them himself. He did not have clerks draft the opinions. He had a lot of wonderful law clerks over the years.
Plenty of them are still around, and
Many of them are still good friends of mine.
I enjoy talking to them about that. They say that, clerking for your grandfather was, way more fun than, we compared notes with the clerks for the other justices, and we realized that we had it pretty easy.
Well, I think my father would talk with them about the cases and collaborate with them about the cases, and they would do research for him. But
he wrote the
he
work.
would actually be the one who drafted.
Pretty unusual.
He insisted on that.
Yeah.
He did.
And what did your classmates at Harvard think about the fact that your father was, a high state court?
I think they were mystified by it. And I think they probably thought we lived on a plantation.
Yeah.
And they didn't really understand.
But not only are you Southern, right?
Right, I'm Southern, but my father's a member of the state Supreme Court, and it was a strange time in some ways in the 70s. While my father was on the court, it was great, but we also had Ray Blanton as governor of Tennessee, and that erupted into a really horrible crisis, scandal that was on the national news. Walter Cronkite would talk about it, and so Tennessee was kind of in the news in a not very good way at that time.
In my experience, when Tennessee is on the national news, it's usually not good.
Sometimes it's not good. And that was true back then.
So you worked at the Trabue firm your first summer.
Right. I spent the summer.
What did you
there.
do?
I did mostly research and writing, memo writing.
You remember who you
writing.
worked with?
Really, it was a small firm. Almost everybody. I would say the firm, I say small, it wasn't. Excuse me, it wasn't really small for Nashville. It probably had maybe less than 20, but close to 20 lawyers, maybe 18 lawyers.
Where were their offices?
And they were in the Life and Casualty Tower.
Right
On the
next to where we are.
25th and 26th floor of the Life and Casualty Tower. And I worked for a great many of them, if not all. Of course, a lot of them had been my father's law partners, so I knew them. I'd known them growing up. And they were a really nice group of people and really good lawyers. Nashville did not have large law firms in those days at all.
Was it the biggest?
The largest firm, Trabue wasn't the biggest, but it was among the biggest. And
What was the biggest back
I
then?
think maybe Asbury and Sims had 20 some lawyers, perhaps, and I don't remember how much.
A little bit bigger.
But under 30 for sure. So a little bit bigger, but not much bigger. And the bar was a lot smaller. And so the Nashville was different from even some other southern cities back then that had larger law firms. Nashville did not.
Birmingham's always had.
Birmingham had law firms that were maybe 80 or 100 lawyers. Nashville had none that were like that
Why do you think that
in
is?
those days. I think maybe the way that the law firms grew up in Nashville, they would have some anchor clients. Often it would be a bank. And each bank at the time, I remember who the banks were, had a law firm that was sort of closely affiliated with that firm. And that would be an important relationship for that firm that would let it do well. And Birmingham had steel industry and heavier industry, more so than we had in Nashville. That's all I can come up with.
Well,
But
and
Nashville did not have big law firms.
and that reminds me of something that I did want to make sure we captured today. You know, you told me that when your father was in private practice before he took the bench, that he never kept his time.
He never did. My father would handle cases.
And he was a litigator.
He was, and he did both defense cases and plaintiff's cases. Back then, and all lawyers were this way. He did a lot of everything. So one of his partners, Mr. Minnick, did a lot of bond work, and that was lucrative work, I think. They handled trusts and estates. My father wrote a lot of wills. My father did a lot of divorce cases. That was another thing that was a constant. And again, I think most lawyers did a great variety of things back in.
But so how would he charge clients?
So he would work on a case and then look at it at the end and say, well, this took a good bit of work. He had not kept his time. He did not bill by the hour, but he would look at the case and think about the outcome and send a bill that would say professional services, $5,000. And that would be how he got paid. If it was a contingent case, he would get a third of the recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And that was occasional, not often, but occasional.
And so we got a little off topic, but this is good stuff. Where did you work your second summer in law school?
So after my second year, I did something totally different from the Nashville experience. I went to a New York law firm, Trabue, Swain and Moore. And
did they come recruit you and interview you at Harvard?
They did. So in second year, it's still that way. There would be on-campus interviews. Law firms from all over the country would come and you would sign up for interviews. And Trabue was, I think, considered sort of the prize.
I think that's still the case.
Prize place to work. It was very respected law firm and very demanding law firm. You needed the best grades to get a job there and so forth. And so I was lucky enough to get an offer from Trabue, and I went there along with a good many of my classmates from Harvard, and lived in New York for a summer, that summer of 1979.
And who'd you live with in New York?
And Jim Cooper was my roommate in New York.
And because, hopefully Jim will watch this someday and other people who know him will. Tell us about where Jim slept.
So we had an apartment on West 12th Street in New York, which is in Greenwich Village. And we were on the 8th floor of a really beautiful apartment.
Well, and who the apartment belonged to?
And it belonged to a man named Benny Montresor, who was a Italian set director, somebody in the film industry, and a pretty famous guy. And it was a big apartment with a lot of space, but no air conditioning, except there was a window unit in one room. It was not a bedroom. It was sort of a living space. And Jim decided he liked the air-conditioned room, and so he moved his bed into that room and slept in the air-conditioned room all summer. I think he would bear that out.
I'm glad we've captured that for
posterity.
Posterity, yeah. I've asked him about that before, and he's acknowledged it. So.
He admits it.
He admits it. He's not in Congress anymore. So
no, he's not in. He can admit things.
I think he can. And so, obviously, what I want to ask about, one experience that you had while working at Trabue, which was that you were working on a case with them, and they took you to England.
Yeah. So, I was assigned to the corporate department at Trabue and worked with a really wonderful partner. I now realize was probably sort of a younger partner. Again, he seemed older to me, named Tom Brome. And he asked me one day if I had a passport. And I said, yes, I do. I had been to Europe the summer of 1977 before law school. And so I had gotten
With Mark Kelly.
with Mark Kelly and my friend from Nashville. And so I had gotten a passport and I said, yes, I do have a passport. He said, well, good. We're going to England for a couple of weeks. We need to do an internal investigation of a company that's based in England. There had been a law recently passed when Jimmy Carter was president. I think it was during his term, called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And that act was generating a lot of concern among businesses for whether they were violating it and whether there were payments to minor officials or major officials.
That's basically what it prohibits, right?
That's what it prohibits. And so
If you're doing business in a foreign country, you can't
bribe the
bribe.
officials, right?
because that was commonplace before that.
Perhaps that's why the law was
Yeah.
passed. And
I think it still is, but
and so this important client of Cravath needed an internal investigation about that. And we took a team of, I'm not sure how many lawyers, probably at least 4 or 5, went to England for a couple of weeks. And
well, and how did you get to
and
England?
we flew to England on the Concorde, which isn't still flying anymore, but took about, I don't know, maybe 3 hours to get from New York to London.
And who was on your flight?
And on my airplane were Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton, among others. We saw them walk down the aisle.
It was a small plane, right?
It's got a small interior
Yeah.
space, but it's luxurious. I mean, they give you champagne and stuff like that.
I'm sure you remember that pretty well.
I do. It was nice.
And so, then, after that summer, you did your 3L year, obviously, and you decided, Cravath made you an offer.
They did. Cravath
You
made me
turned
an
them
offer
down.
to come, and I turned it down to come back to Nashville, in part because I had met your mom.
Right. Well, we're going to talk about that. don't worry.
Okay, and we had to decide together where will we live. And
Y'all had already got engaged.
we had gotten engaged. She was a classmate, Patty Brill, she was a classmate at Harvard. And she had also clerked at a law firm in New York that summer. She worked for Cadwalader, Wickersham and Taft in New York on Wall Street. I remember their address was 1 Wall Street. And she worked for them that summer. Jim Cooper worked for Simpson Thatcher. And we were all friends. We had a big group of friends in New York. And we had to then decide in our 3rd year, where will we end up? And I persuaded her. I had a lot of family in Nashville and we wanted to have children. And so we felt like it would be a better place to raise children in Nashville than in New York, although we had friends who did that very successfully.
Did you all ever think about actually staying in New York?
We thought about it.
Was it a hard decision?
Was it a hard decision? I think my pull personally to Nashville was strong enough that it wasn't that hard for me. I had to persuade her a little bit. That it would be okay. She had not really been to the South very much, and Nashville was a different place.
She was from Cleveland,
She was
Ohio.
from Cleveland, Ohio, and Nashville was a really southern city back then. And she was skeptical about that, but we got married that summer of 1980 and took the Tennessee bar, actually took the Tennessee bar at the end of July and then got married in August of 1980.
And so where did you all live, like when you first were married in Nashville?
I found an apartment in the Westboro, which was on West End Avenue, pretty close to downtown. And
Still there?
it's still there. The building is still there. It's an older building. We were on the 3rd floor, walk up of a old apartment building, but it was a great apartment. And your mom moved in there that summer. I stayed at home. We studied for the bar that summer, and I worked at the Trabue firm where I was going to go practice. I accepted an offer at that firm and clerked there before the bar.
Because that was common then, right? Because now,
Yeah.
when we make, we hire people who are in their third year of law school, right? We
Right.
extend them an offer, usually like while they're summering for us before they start their
Right.
third year. And then they accept but they don't start working until the fall after they've taken the bar.
Right, back then it was, and that's what your mom did. She
Right.
actually studied for the bar and didn't work during that.
Oh, she
time
did not.
period.
Okay,
She
I
did
thought she
not.
had.
But I did. I was trying to save money for a honeymoon.
Mhm.
And so I worked as a law clerk up until about 2 weeks before the bar, and then I stopped and really studied hard for those 2 weeks.
And did you and mom, were you all in the same bar review class?
We were. The bar review class was at night. It was taught by John Payne and Bob Crossley, who were two great Knoxville
I
lawyers.
mean, Don Payne was on my bar review class.
Yeah, he was a legend and really amazing and a vibrant lecturer and entertaining and fun. And I still remember that bar review course.
Who were some people that you remember taking that with?
So my friend Roy Heron was in that bar review class. Bill Tate was in that class. Gary Brown and Mike Richardson, who I ended up working with at Trabue, were there. Dudley West was there. He had clerked for my father. A lot of people that I'm still friends with.
And so after that, you got married and then you started your career as a lawyer at
Yes.
Trabue. I guess that would have been in the fall of 1980.
The fall of 1980, I started, and I, of course, was clerking still at that point because I hadn't gotten the bar results. And I became a member of the bar in, I think, October of 1980.
And what was your salary at Trabue?
It was, I think, $21,500.
And
As a first year.
I assume my mother will watch this interview. And so where did she work?
And she went to work for Bolt Cummings, Connors and Berry, which was a really good.
Which is now Bradley, right?
Which is now Bradley Arant, has merged with Bradley Arant.
And what was her salary?
And she made $22,000 a year. So she made $500 more than I did. Which, was actually a pretty big difference at that time. So, yeah.
And so when you started at Trabue, and let's just start, October of 1980, you're now a licensed attorney.
Right.
What did you do?
So I did a little bit of everything, which is what a lot of people did back then. I worked on some transactions. I handled cases. I tried a jury trial with Ward DeWitt. That was a corporate dispute. Judge Nixon was in federal court. Judge Nixon was the judge. That was a wonderful experience. And Mr. DeWitt was an amazing lawyer and amazing with a jury.
Did you win?
And we did win. After his closing argument, he made a really wonderful closing argument, I remember.
Did you get to take any witnesses?
I did. And I did some of the argument too. I think
So you did that within your first?
That was within my first 2 years of law
Oh.
practice that I got to do that jury trial with Mr. DeWitt. I worked a lot with Tom Peebles, who was an amazing litigator.
You've told me before that you said that Tom Peebles is the one that taught you how to be a lawyer.
He taught me how to be able to do litigation.
Mhm.
He did it in such a good way.
Why?
And we had, well, he was courteous, and he taught me early on that the way you should practice law in Nashville is to be courteous to the other lawyers. And he did that.
It's not always easy.
No, but he did that. And he just taught me by example, I guess. He had learned a lot from my father, he told me. Of course, my father was a judge at that time, so he wasn't practicing law anymore. But I did learn a lot from the lawyers there.
I think I've told you, I had a case recently against his son, Tommy,
Yeah,
who's,
there's another wonderful lawyer.
closer to your age than mine, I guess,
Yeah.
but, and Tommy Peebles and I were in court in front of Hamilton Gate
Mhm.
and I don't remember exactly why we were there that one day, but it was a condemnation case. And, Judge Gaten was very pleased to see us like laughing and being friends. And we announced to the court that, what did Tommy say? Tommy said, well, Jay's grandfather taught me how to practice law, and I just turned and I said, yeah, well, your father taught my father how to practice law.
true.
So we've kind of,
There was a lot of tradition.
come full circle here. And of course,
Yes.
Hamilton Gayden thought that was
He
great.
liked that,
Yeah,
I'm
thought
sure.
thought that
Yeah.
was great.
Yeah.
Probably one of the last cases he did.
Yeah.
Because that was about a year ago,
Yes.
fairly recently. What kind of hours did you keep, as an associate at Trabue?
So, don't really remember, but by that time, the firm was billing by the hour. My father never had done that. He stopped practicing in 1974 to become a judge, but I kept time. I'm sure my hourly rate was really modest, extremely modest. And, I was taught to keep track of what I spent my time on each day and record it for what clients I'd worked on that day. And I always worked on, not always, but usually worked on a bunch of different matters in one day. And unless it was a trial or something where it was all day for one client, but usually it was a lot of different clients. And I don't know for sure how many hours I billed, but I suspect it was in the range of 1,800 hours a year, I think.
And how long were you an associate at Trabue?
So I worked at Trabue for until the fall of 1983. And at that time, two of the Trabue lawyers had a short time earlier left to form their own law firm, and that's Tom Sherrard and John Rowe. So I had practiced with them at Trabue. They were transactional lawyers for the most part, and really wonderful, smart lawyers. John had been number one in his class at Vanderbilt Law School. Yeah. Tom had taught at Vanderbilt Law School and was still teaching at Vanderbilt. So there was a strong connection to Vanderbilt Law School that they had. And they left to start a very small, brand new firm that was called O'Hare, Sherrard and Rowe. Jim O'Hare from the Waller Lanston firm had joined them. And they had an office in the St. Cloud corner on the corner of Church Street and Fifth Avenue.
Where Puckett's is now.
Where Puckett's is now, but we were upstairs. We were on the fourth floor. So I left to join that law firm, which was a startup and brand new.
And what, so you were what, fifth lawyer there?
I was the fifth lawyer, I think. And it was a new law firm, and it was a little bit scary. And it was a sort of a leap of faith.
Well,
But it was brand new and it was exciting.
And talk about, what your father said about taking that leap versus what mom said.
Well, let's see. My father was cautious, and he knew that where I was at Trabue was a secure spot. And at one point I said to him, though, I think I'm going to do this, and I really want your support. And he said, well, you have it.
Right.
And your mom, on the other hand, knew Tom Sherrard, knew John Rowe, and said, you need to do this.
She was very encouraging.
She was very encouraging, and it has never been, I've never looked back.
She likes to brag about how right she was.
She was right about it.
She was, I mean,
She was right about it. Because I ended up having I would have had wonderful colleagues at Trabue too, but
yeah.
But this was new and exciting, and it was a chance to build something brand new. And I've never regretted it.
And so did you come in as an associate?
Yes, I was 20. How old was I? I think I was 28.
28, or maybe 29.
I was about
I
to turn
was
28.
alive.
You were
A baby.
you were a baby when I did that. And we didn't have our other children at that time. And
Y'all were still living on West Hillwood.
we lived on West Hillwood Drive in a little ranch house on West Hillwood Drive at that time. And
By the way, what was the interest rate on that mortgage for that house?
it was about 14%. It was a period of huge inflation. I mean, we have inflation now, but I remember much worse inflation.
Yeah, 14% seemed.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy.
Pretty bad. And so you came in as an associate but you became a partner relatively.
I became a
quickly.
partner after just a couple of years or less. It was quick.
Uh-huh.
They needed me, and it was a beginning, law firm, and so they made me a partner.
How did you get clients?
Tom Sherrard was always really good at getting clients. And so of course, you always start like you do at any law firm, I think, where you start out. I mean, I worked.
You
on
handled
matters.
other people's cases.
Handled other people's cases, and I've worked on clients that were already clients of the firm for the most part. I was lucky because I was from Nashville and I knew a lot of people in Nashville, and my friends sent me work. And so I had a lot of opportunity that way. But, it was a matter of working on a matter for Tom Sherrard and getting to know that client, and that client would ask for something else.
Well, and you told me before that one of your early first clients that you had was the homeowners association or the board of directors of a condo.
Yes. My friend Brock Baker lived at Villager East.
Who had been your freshman roommate?
He'd been my freshman roommate in college, and he was a classmate in high school. And he lived in a condominium, which was a fairly new thing. Condominiums were a relatively new concept, and they had homeowner associations that governed the condominium group, and they needed lawyers, it turned out. And so I became the lawyer for Villager East Homeowners Association, got to know the manager of that, the property manager. And
Is that Tony?
no, he was on the board.
Okay.
And so I got to know the board members of that association. And pretty quickly, I represented 20 or 30 homeowner associations because there weren't many lawyers doing that.
And you still do that today?
I do it a little bit. Lisa Helton in my firm now does it. So I've tried to transition a lot of that to her.
That can be kind of difficult work at times.
It's time consuming work and difficult work. You have to go to homeowners meetings often at night or on the weekends. And I've kind of gotten tired of that.
And I think I've done some myself. I think any lawyer that's ever dealt with HOA issues knows that sometimes the problems are very real and existential and big, but sometimes they're petty, I guess.
Sometimes they're people have really high emotions about them, even though the problems are really not that big. So it was an opportunity to meet a lot of people.
Yeah, what gets you out,
and
right?
to go to court and to be in front of groups, and so yes, it was a way to build a reputation.
And then talk about how you kind of grew your practice regarding kind of the estate planning side and like the litigation aspect of that. Because I think anybody that knows you knows that you've done a large amount of that your entire career. And how did that?
So I do like this story. When I was at Trabue, so
I don't think I realized
first or second year lawyer, I was assigned to do a guardianship for two little girls whose names were Tracy and Keely Rogers. And it was a matter of helping their father do the annual accountings for the guardianship. Their mother had died when they were really young, and they were little girls. They were maybe 8 and 10. And
was this a court appointed thing?
It was a court appointed. Their father became their court appointed guardian because they had an inheritance from their mother and they were too young to inherit it. So there had to be a guardianship. And it was very routine work. I would fill out the inventory and with a pencil and do the accounting with an adding machine. And it was really simple, but something that needed to be done. And so it was assigned to me. I did it for a couple of years. And then their great-grandmother died. The girl's great-grandmother died. She lived in Houston County and owned a general store. And she left a will that left her estate to these two girls. And the girl's grandmother, the daughter of the lady that died, contested the will and said, no, the estate should go to me. And it was, by today's standards, probably a pretty modest estate, but it was meaningful. There was some real estate. There was a general store that operated in Yellow Creek, Tennessee. And so all of a sudden, I had a will contest that I needed to defend. And I needed to propound this will and defend this will that left the assets to Tracy and Keith.
So the first will you ever propounded?
It was the first will contest. Well, no, that's wrong. I did a will contest with Mr. DeWitt. So I had done one will contest before. And which was good because
You had a little bit of
it wasn't
experience.
unheard of
Yeah.
for me. But I didn't really find anybody who had done very many of them.
But this one was yours.
This one was mine because the father, Mike Rogers, called me and said, "What do we do?" And you're our lawyer. Because I was doing the guardianship work. And it led to a will contest that had to get tried in Houston County, in Erin, Tennessee. And it was a week-long trial, and I got it ready. And my then partner by that time I had switched to O'Hare, Sherrard and Rowe. But very recently, I think it was tried in the summer of 1984. And it was a week-long jury trial, and we won the case. Ken Jones, one of my colleagues at O'Hare, tried it with me, and we had a great time, and we were making it up as we went. And there were a lot of witnesses. One of my witnesses was Ashley Wilshire, who was the director of the Legal Aid Society. And so I had some pretty good witnesses, Ashley being one of the best. And he had known the lady. And so we won the case. The other side appealed it, went to the Court of Appeals, and I argued it in the court, briefed it and argued it in the Court of Appeals.
Was that your first appellate argument?
Gosh, that's a good question. It might not have been my very first appellate argument, but it was early. And Bill Koch wrote the opinion, Judge Koch on the Court of Appeals at the time, wrote the opinion, and we won that appeal. And of course, that was a public case, and it led to my doing a lot of contested estate work, which I still do.
How many will contests, like trials, do you think you've had?
How many have I had? I haven't kept up exactly, but it's maybe a dozen.
Yeah.
It's a lot. I mean, it's a lot of different will cases over the years, and then on top of that, trust cases and other types of estate disputes that I've done over the years. So altogether, it's, good many more than that.
People ask me if they don't know us, maybe it's an out-of-town lawyer or something, and I mentioned that, my father is a lawyer in Nashville, and they say, "Oh, well, what does he do?" And my answer is oftentimes, pretty varied practice.
Yes.
But my answer, and I'm asking this to see if you agree.
Yeah.
My answer is oftentimes, to the extent he has a specialty, would be in, both the planning side, is estate, the transactional aspects of estate planning, but then also that you've done quite a bit of litigation regarding,
That's true.
trust in estates, which is a fairly niche area.
It's a niche. There aren't very many lawyers really in the state that do it. There's some good ones, but not that many.
I mean, I think there's plenty of lawyers that have done, one,
Yes.
here or there,
Yes.
but in terms of a kind of a regular practice, there aren't that many of them.
No, and for me, it's been a regular part of it. Ever since the Rogers case, it's been a regular recurring part of my practice.
Yeah.
It has.
So talk about the, and we'll get to, your, like, I want to kind of move to like the middle of your career, I guess, right? When I was a teenager, perhaps. It seems to me, from my perspective, like things started to change a lot when I was, maybe an early teenager. That, we bought a nice big new house.
I was doing better.
You were doing better.
Yeah. Probably so.
And, why do you think that was, and what kind of changed, between like 1990 and 1995?
Well, that's a good question. One thing that happened in 1990 is that my father joined my law firm. He went off the court, and he did not live a long time after that, but from 1990 to 1993, he was a member of my law firm. And
They made him a partner right away.
They made him a partner right away. As it should have.
And your offices were next to each other.
We were right next to each other, so we saw each other every day. And I wouldn't trade anything for that. And that was a wonderful time. The late 80s and early 90s were sort of another downturn in the economy time. So the late 80s and early 90s, the law had changed, tax laws had changed. Some of our work as a firm became less available. And we
The
had transactional side had become less profitable. And I started doing more litigation and had some success in some bigger cases and some big estate cases. And so some of those lasted a long time. And so that in my own personal time, that was helpful. And then another thing that happened is that our firm got a big client through Tom Sherrard, and that was Gaylord Entertainment Company, which at that time had Opryland and Opryland Hotel and Grand Ole Opry, WSM Radio. It became a very significant client. And so we started doing well as a firm.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the boot case.
The boot case was an estate case it's probably my biggest estate case in terms of how long it lasted. Mr. Boot was
pretty big in terms of dollars.
It was big. It was a big estate. Mr. Boot was a man who had invested in Lay's potato chips in the 1940s, and his investment grew, turned into Frito-Lay, it turned into Pepsi, it turned into other publicly traded stocks, and his estate was worth tens of millions of dollars, and it was a big estate. And
when did he die?
He died in about 2000, and his two daughters were my clients, and his second wife was contested his estate, and there was a prenuptial agreement which we litigated. There were a lot of will issues that we litigated. There was a codicil that got contested. That case went to the Court of Appeals 4 separate times on different aspects of the case.
And were each of those your appeals?
And they were
issues
all but one were my appealing what the trial court had done. And that case lasted about 10 years. So it was a big case, and it led to some important opinions. Also, mostly, if not entirely, by Judge Koch,
right?
Authored by Judge Koch, and so I think it really those became some important opinions on things like solemn form probate and some sort of obscure estate issues, but and also on prenuptial agreements.
And you worked that case with Andre Blumstein.
Andre Blumstein was my partner at that time. We had been associates together at the Trabue firm, and she became one of my closest friends, and still is. I'm having lunch with her tomorrow. And she's now the Solicitor General of Tennessee.
And so you and Andre, when did Andre come to, I guess what was then O'Hare, Sherrard, and Rowe?
She actually came when it changed to just Sherrard and Rowe. Jim O'Hare left and went to Baker Donaldson. I think it was called High School Donaldson back then.
What year would that have been?
And that would have been in around the early 90s.
I remember. I remember
exactly what year, maybe around 1990.
Mm-hmm.
And Andre came to the firm in the early 90s and practiced there, and she and I practiced together a lot until she left for the Solicitor General's position a few years ago. But she and I worked on the boot case, and so did my partner, Mark Smith. It was a big case and involved a lot of money, and it involved a lot of contested things.
And what wasn't Mike Sontag was involved somehow?
Mike Sontag had drafted the prenuptial agreement and the will.
So
Mike
was he a witness?
Mike was my witness, and and we ultimately got his work upheld and affirmed by the Court of Appeals.
I'm sure he appreciated
which
that.
I think he appreciated. And then later, Mike defended a prenuptial agreement that I had written and got it affirmed. So we've done that for each other.
Because Mike has, obviously kind of occupied that same space as you a little bit in terms of
He does.
both the planning, estate planning aspects, but Mike also will litigate,
Yes, he has.
contested issues. in
Yes,
estate.
he's had somewhat similar practice. I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. I remember I had to read I had a research project in law school where I had to write a prenup.
Yes.
And I was given a made up fact pattern by a very clever professor who, threw in facts just to make it as difficult as possible. And my partner, Devin Holbrook, who actually works at Bass now with Mike some, I think, and I had to draft a prenup together, and we read all the boot opinions, and because they weren't that old at that point.
No, they were pretty new at that point. Yeah.
And found the answers.
They were important cases.
Found the answers that we needed. Yeah. Talk about Marshall Green for a second, because I don't want to.
So I'd like to talk about Marshall. When I first started at O'Hare, Sherrard and Rome, a guy named Marshall Green had been a law clerk for the firm in the summer, and he joined as an associate not all that long after I came to the firm, maybe a year after. And he became a very close friend, and we worked together on lots of things. Marshall was a force of nature. He was Irish. He had the gift of gab. He actually took over a lot of the homeowners association work that I had done and had been doing.
When did he come over to O'Hare?
He came straight from law school.
Oh, he did.
He
Oh,
did.
okay.
He was our, I think, our first sort of homegrown lawyer.
Okay.
At the firm.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah. And
he's a couple of years younger than you.
He's a little bit younger than I was, but not a lot.
Yeah.
And he became a very close friend and somebody that I worked with a lot. And Marshall, like a lot of us, did a little bit of everything. And the very sad, Marshall ended up leaving the firm to join a friend of his named Jeff Green, and they formed a firm called Green and Green. But not long after that, which was in the 90s sometime, Marshall got brain cancer and died when he was only 37.
Oh gosh.
So
it was. I remember it.
It was terrible, and he was a wonderful person and a wonderful lawyer, and I was lucky to know him.
Well, and Marshall was a little different.
Marshall was from Chicago area. He was not Southern. But he befriended people in the bar. One of the people he really befriended was Aubrey Harwell, who's at your firm.
Mm-hmm.
And Aubrey kind of took Marshall under his wing and helped him a lot. And they were both involved in the Boy Scouts.
The Boy Scouts, right.
Marshall was a very avid scout himself. He'd been an Eagle Scout, and then he was involved in the Boy Scouts in a big way.
Well, and of course, I ended up going to law school with, Marshall had many children.
He had 6 children, but you went to school with one of them.
With Nathaniel, right?
Yeah, and he's a lawyer now.
Who's now at Bass, right?
Yes, yes.
But, Nathaniel, Green Harbison,
Yes.
GRHA, was not in my section,
Yeah.
because my section started at like GU, I think. So he was
Yes.
one off from me in my main section.
With your last name.
But he was in section 1, I was in section 2, but he was in my small legal writing class.
Yes.
Because my legal writing class spanned sections 1 and 2.
Yes.
And so I'm in class, class with this guy, only 2 days a week, my first semester. And I think it took like most of the semester before I realized who he was.
Because you remember Marshall.
Oh, I remember him.
You're old enough to remember
Well,
Marshall.
talk about Marshall's office.
Marshall collected toys. And so Marshall would have, and particularly Star Wars toys. So his office would have toys in it. And when I would bring you and your sisters up to the office on the weekends to come to work with me, Marshall's office was a magnet because it was full of toys.
I remember it vividly.
It was full of toys and fun things to play with. And Marshall was always that way. He was always fun, and had a great spirit.
So shifting gears a little bit, because I know we've been going for a while, talk about, being involved in the bar associations and how that's, been important to you.
So, my father had been president of the Nashville Bar when I was in high school. And I had come to events, and he'd always gone to Tennessee bar events too. So
and your mother was.
My mother was in what was then called the Bar Auxiliary, which is an outdated concept now, rightly so, but it was typically.
And that's how she knew Joyce Binkley.
Well, yeah, she was very good. It was very good friends with Joyce Binkley, Tom Binkley's wife.
And Joyce is still around.
And Joyce is still with us. They were involved in the bar auxiliary. So the bar had been, I guess I would say, part of my life as long as I can remember. Bar events were part of my life. And
Picnics as a kid and that kind of thing.
things like that, yes. And so early in my career, I became chair of the Nashville Bar Continuing Legal Education Committee. This is before it was mandatory CLE.
Oh, I don't think I
And
realized.
the bar put on CLE.
Wait, it didn't used to be mandatory.
It was not mandatory, no. It didn't become mandatory until I think about 1985 or 6. But I became chair of the Nashville Bar CLE committee earlier than that. And it was a great opportunity because I would invite speakers to come to Nashville, and it was a chance to get to be around prominent speakers, prominent lawyers. And so being involved in the Nashville Bar and the Tennessee Bar primarily were something I guess I just knew I wanted to do. And it's been a wonderful thing for me, for my career. I still go to Tennessee Bar conventions. I try to go to the Nashville Bar events. I go to the Nashville Bar picnic, often with you and your wife. So then I became president of the Nashville Bar in 1999, I believe. And after that, I did a lot of work in the Tennessee Bar and became president of the Tennessee Bar in 2015. So I've done a lot of work at both Nashville and Tennessee Bar Association.
And you've gotten a lot out of both, right?
I've gotten a lot out of both and made friends across the state.
And work.
And I've gotten a lot of referrals. It has been beneficial to my career to do that. That's not the main reason. I don't think that I did it, but it has provided that, and it's provided me with speaking opportunities, writing opportunities.
Well, I think it's something that, a lot of younger lawyers today, it's different for me, right? Because, I have had you to learn from and Aubrey.
Yes.
But you had, your father, obviously, but I think, a lot of younger lawyers today don't see the benefit of it.
I think that is a worry. I mean, it's certainly there are a lot more lawyers than there were back then, and
A lot more specialization.
and more specialization, and it's there's a lot of pressure to bill hours. I realize that, and when you take time to do bar association activities, it's not a direct benefit to your law firm necessarily, or to you personally. It's an indirect benefit, but it's an education benefit, it's a social benefit, it's an experience benefit.
Let me ask you the question kind of more directly, I guess. Do you think it's fair to say that out of all the time that you've spent doing bar association activities, that you have gotten, and I understand this is not the primary reason, but that you have gotten work that you would not have otherwise gotten?
Oh, yeah,
that outweighs that time.
for sure. I've gotten referrals from other lawyers that I would never have gotten if I hadn't been involved in bar work.
Including some big cases.
Big cases, without a doubt, some big cases. But of course, the friendships that you make with other lawyers and the experience you get from other lawyers, and from writing yourself or working on bar projects yourself, that's really valuable just in and of itself. So I've been really lucky to have a lot of opportunities in the Nashville Bar and the Tennessee Bar, and they've both been very important part of my life.
Talk about teaching at Nashville School of Law.
Yeah, in 2005, I got a call from Joe Loser, who was a retired judge and dean of the Nashville School of Law, saying, "Bill, we need a contracts teacher. Will you do it?" And, I'd been a lawyer for a pretty long time at that point. And actually, my very first will contest was in Judge Loser's court. I think it was Third Circuit Court in Nashville, because he was a judge when I started practicing law. And he called me and asked me to do it, and I said yes. And so I taught it, and I taught first-year contracts at Nashville School of Law from 2005 until 2022, till last year. And so 17 years, and that has been a really wonderful part of my life too. I've gotten to meet a lot of wonderful people.
And I mean, again, like bar association activities, I know this, of course, is not the reason you did it, but you got work out of doing that too.
I got referrals from students that some of those have been remarkable.
Some of those were really good.
Remarkable opportunities. Yeah, it's like anything that you put effort into, it comes back in unexpected ways. And a lot of those ways are just that when I go around the state, I see former students very regularly now, because there are about 100 in the class.
Right.
And so I taught hundreds of students over those years.
A pretty formative class also.
Yes, and it's a first-year contracts is a basic course. And I've tried to channel Clark Bice, who I talked about at the beginning, who was my contracts professor. I can't have his personality, but I can remember the way he taught, and I've tried to do, it's a Socratic method, and I've tried to do that.
Yeah, you've always been big on that.
I have. I'm big on the Socratic method.
But you weren't super hard on them in terms of like cold calling.
No, I wasn't. And in fact, I called on them in alphabetical order.
So they knew when they were up.
They would know when they were up, and I thought that was more humane.
Well, and I can say, as a practicing lawyer myself, it's very nice to have a 1L contracts professor who you were directly related to, because, as I've had, over the years, kind of discrete contract issues.
A lot of contract cases.
And,
it's fun to talk about.
it is fun to talk about, but do you think that teaching opportunity and the 17 or so years of doing it like enhanced your own skills?
Oh, without a doubt, because I had to be ready for the students, but it also made me think about contract law in a much more focused way than you would if you're just doing a case, a particular
Right,
case.
because
you think of the whole span of contract law and how it's developed and what it means, and yes, it's been really beneficial.
I can, conceptually understand and, know certain terms from 1L contracts, but, without being immersed in it or having a case about that exact thing,
Right.
it doesn't, but for you, it flows off the tongue, like,
It does now.
Yeah, right.
Those concepts come naturally.
Like
now
innovation, right?
I've worked with them for a long time now.
Right. I think most lawyers, with at least a somewhat varied practice like me, would say, I know innovation is a thing.
Yes.
But I need to go
Yes.
maybe read a case or
When
two.
does it need consideration? When does it not need new consideration?
Right.
Things like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you after teaching it for so long,
It comes naturally.
It
now
comes
for a
naturally.
while.
That's-
It does.
I think I've always thought that was really neat.
I've enjoyed it.
I do want to talk about a couple of kind of notable things, that have either happened to you or that you've done kind of, in, the third phase of your career, I guess. So like within the past, 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
First I want to talk about, you were, at this point, it's been a while, but you were, at least considered, your name was put in for a possible appointment to the Sixth Circuit.
My friend Jim Cooper encouraged me to do that at one point when we had President Obama in the White House, and I allowed Jim to put my name forward. I had some interviews about it. It ultimately did not go to me, which was fine.
I mean, it went to a real good judge.
It went to a good friend of mine whom I'm really fond of, and who is a great judge. And things like that have a way of working out.
Right.
And it has worked out.
Right.
I've been able to stay.
Were you disappointed when you didn't get it?
I will say in some ways maybe, but not in other ways. I'm happy to be a practicing lawyer. And not long after that opportunity did not materialize, I got some big cases that I was able to do. And as a practicing lawyer.
That you wouldn't have gotten to
I
do.
wouldn't have gotten to do.
So,
otherwise.
yeah, let's talk about some of those. Let's talk about one of Villegas first.
So one of Villegas was an undocumented person who lived and worked in Nashville, raised a family here in Nashville, and was arrested by the Metro Police
What was she arrested for?
for allegedly rolling through a stop sign without stopping all the way. And at the time, she was 9 months pregnant. She was sent to the Metro jail and almost immediately went into labor. And she was transported to the general hospital. And their policy at the time was that all inmates had to be shackled at all times. So she was shackled during her transport in the ambulance to the hospital. She was shackled during her labor and delivery of her child. And then she was sent back to jail.
And where was her baby?
And her baby was not with her. And
They denied her a breast pump.
she asked for a breast pump. They didn't give her a breast pump. It was harsh. It was overly harsh. And it really was challenging the practices. Well, we took her case. My law firm took her case, and it received a lot of attention because the treatment of undocumented persons, what her treatment was unduly harsh.
And this was about like what, 2011, 2012?
Yeah, somewhere in that time frame. And we filed a case for her in federal court and
1983.
a 1983 action against the metropolitan.
Had you done any of those before?
A little bit. I had done an election case for Phil Bredesen when he ran for mayor in the 80s. I had done a little bit of constitutional work, but
you weren't exactly like
I wasn't a specialist.
you weren't like the go-to 1983
No,
guy.
I'm still not. And
I'm not so sure about that.
but we did take her case. We had a jury. Our judge was Joe Haynes in federal court, and he issued a summary judgment that her constitutional rights had been violated, that she was entitled to an award. Ultimately, some of that ruling was reversed by the Sixth Circuit and it was sent back. We tried her case and the jury awarded her $200,000 of damages. And it was a 3-day jury trial, I remember, in federal court. And it received a lot of attention because of the way she had been treated. And she has gone on to be a real advocate for the rights of immigrants and how people should be treated. And the Metro government changed its policy on shackling. So that was a significant case.
And you got your attorney's fees.
And we were ultimately awarded an attorney's fee for prevailing in that case, which we settled the amount of the attorney's fees, but the award was there.
Right.
In fact, I think Judge Haynes, and I know he actually wrote an opinion on our attorney's fees where he doubled them because of the controversy of the case. There were a lot of hateful things said about that case.
Well, and you all, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if I remember correctly, you all put in proof on that.
We did.
Right, like
So
social media
comments,
comments
yeah.
and stuff like that, and
Death threats.
and you used that to support a higher field.
Yes, and we had affidavits from Nashville lawyers, including George Barrett. George suggested that our fees should be doubled, and the court did that. But we settled after that. But that was a meaningful case, for sure.
And then after that, I know there's a couple others, maybe we can touch on them, but we obviously need to talk about Tanco v. Haslett.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that case and then maybe close to wrap up.
Sure.
So after the Villegas case, you were in law school, and you had befriended a faculty member at University of Tennessee Law School named Regina Lambert, and Regina and some other lawyers, including Abby Rubenfeld, wanted to bring a case challenging the laws that existed in Tennessee prohibiting same-sex marriages.
And this was just after the Windsor decision.
And Edie Windsor had her case decided in June of 2013.
Correct.
By the U.S. Supreme Court, and they had struck down a portion of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act in a 5-4 opinion, and had forced the recognition of Edie Windsor's marriage for federal estate tax purposes. So the law then had changed to where the federal government had to recognize a valid same-sex marriage, but it had not decided the question of whether states have to do that. And you were in a meeting at University of Tennessee and heard on a statewide conference call about it, and they were as I understand it, they were looking for a law firm to help bring a case.
Yeah, so my now wife Jessie and I were actually at Regina's house.
Yeah.
Regina had been Jesse's professor,
Yeah,
and Jessie became her TA. I never had Regina,
right.
but I got to know her quite well because
Through Jessie.
because she and Jessie became very close. And so
Yes.
we were at, Jessie had just taken the bar exam, I think, and
Yes.
Regina was taking us out to celebrate. And so we were at Regina's house, and Regina invited us to come over a little early because she said, "Hey, I'm going to be on this call, and with lawyers across the state to talk about, bringing a lawsuit in the wake of the Windsor
Yes,
case." And Regina herself, of course, is gay.
yes.
And so we were at Regina's house, and I was just sitting there listening to this conference call, and someone on the conference call made a comment like, "Well, we need I'm paraphrasing, but the gist of it was we need an older kind of gray-haired white guy, straight white man, to be our figurehead and be our champion on this case." And I piped up and said, "I've got one of those."
and so
I actually remember
you called me. You called me from there.
I called you from Regina's
called me
house.
from
I
there.
stepped out onto the patio and called you immediately and said,
Yeah.
"Hey,
Will you do this?
I kind of already signed you up for this. Are you
Yeah.
interested?" And you were like, "Of course." And then I'll let you take it from there.
And I was interested, and that the LGBT rights were something that was bubbling up in the country at that time in a big way. And the Windsor case had certainly been an important stepping stone, but there had been a series of cases that recognized greater and greater rights for gay and lesbian people. And most of those decisions have been authored by Justice Kennedy on the U.S. Supreme Court. I was interested. Abby Rubenfeld, who had been on that call, was a Nashville lawyer who I knew, but not nearly as well as I do now. Now we're really close friends, and Abby was part of that legal team, but they didn't have a law firm. They had sole practitioners.
Right. Well, Abby had been
to
kind of
bring the case.
fighting some of these fights herself for decades.
She'd been doing it her whole career. And so I started talking to Abby, and we did, in fact, bring a case. Abby brought in a national group called NCLR, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, who had some unbelievable lawyers, amazing lawyers. And we filed a case for 3 same-sex couples that lived in Tennessee who were married in other states, but
Validly, legally married.
and one of them was Val Tanko and Sophie Jesty, who were a Knoxville couple. And they were our named plaintiffs. Val was our named plaintiff. So the case was called Tanko versus Haslam. Bill Haslam was the governor at that time. And our case basically sued the state of Tennessee to say that the laws that prohibited recognition of these marriages were unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, both the due process clause and the protection clause. And we filed that case in the fall of 2013. We got a preliminary injunction.
So pretty quickly after I had called you.
Yes, very quickly. We didn't let any time go by, really. And then we got a preliminary injunction from Judge Trauger in, I think, March of 2014. And the state appealed that to the Sixth Circuit. And it just coincidentally, cases from, perhaps not coincidentally, similar cases from Ohio, Kentucky, and Michigan were all arriving in the Sixth Circuit at the same time.
Because that year, basically, in the wake of
Everybody was ready.
Windsor, every state with a law like ours filed these suits.
There were suits in virtually every state that had such law.
Right. It wasn't all of them.
No, some states already recognize same-sex marriage.
Well, like where your plaintiffs had come from.
New York, Massachusetts, Hawaii, California. So, but Tennessee, of course, did not. And there were cases all over the country, and they were all falling in favor of allowing same-sex marriage.
Well, Posner rushed out an opinion pretty quick.
Posner got an opinion out of the Seventh Circuit after our oral argument in the Sixth Circuit. Our case was not consolidated with the cases from the other states in the Sixth Circuit, but we argued all four cases on the same day in August of 2014.
And you argued on behalf
And I
of
argued on
Tennessee.
behalf of the plaintiffs in Tennessee.
And you lost.
Right, Posner issued an opinion from the Seventh Circuit. We argued in August. He issued an opinion in September that was really powerful. And so we kept filing supplemental authority with the Sixth Circuit saying, look, every other court is considering this is saying it should be recognized.
Because by the time you argued the case in the Sixth Circuit, every other, at least circuit opinion addressing the
favor
thing
of marriage
was
equality.
in favor of marriage equality.
It was. All the other cases were in favor of marriage equality. And then in November, the Sixth Circuit decided our case and we lost. And they wrote it was a 2-1. We had a very strong dissent from Judge Daughtry.
Who, of course, replaced your father on the Tennessee Supreme
Who
Court.
had replaced my father on the Tennessee Supreme Court. And she was very much on our side. In fact, she was a friend on the bench during my oral argument when I was facing some pretty difficult questions from the other panel members. She handed me some pretty good friendly questions that helped get me through that oral argument. And but having lost in the Sixth Circuit, we were the first circuit where it had gone the other way, where it had gone against marriage equality. So we appealed.
So your case kind of combined, I understand they weren't consolidated, but your case combined with the other ones from the Sixth Circuit created the split.
Yeah, that decision created the split. And they decided all four cases in one opinion.
Right.
So they were in a sense consolidated, although we had 4 separate sets of briefs, 4 separate arguments. There was one opinion that decided them all. And in the Sixth Circuit.
Written by Judge Sutton.
Written by Judge Sutton. And that created the circuit split. We filed cert petitions. All 4 states filed cert petitions. The plaintiffs in all 4 states did. The first cert petition to reach the court was the Obergefell v. Hodges case, which was from Ohio, with a lawyer that I respect so much, named Al Harbison. He represented the plaintiffs in Ohio. And then it was essentially consolidated at the Supreme Court level. And we still filed 4 separate sets of briefs. But there was one argument that was set for April of 2015, which we all went to, all the lawyers from the team went to. It was one argument on a day, it was a 2.5-hour argument at the US Supreme Court. And then in June of 2015, June 26th, we got a favorable ruling, 5-4, but still a favorable ruling. And we won the case.
Well, and I remember I was in Cincinnati with Judge Merritt when you all had a mock oral argument.
Yes, we
And
did.
because, well, I mean, who argued that case for your
In the
side?
Supreme Court.
Yes.
It was argued by Mary Bonato, who was part of the Michigan team. She was a lesbian lawyer who had argued in the Massachusetts Supreme Court successfully some years earlier. And then a guy named Douglas Hallward-Driemeier, who was from Ropes and Gray, who was our Tennessee person that we had associated at the Supreme Court level. And he had argued a bunch of cases at the US Supreme Court.
Because I remember, when that was all happening, it was, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was some hope that you might be the
Well,
one to get to argue in
you
the US
never
Supreme
know.
Court. I know you never know, but
I had never done a Supreme Court argument, the US Supreme Court. I've done a lot of the appellate arguments, but not,
You still do.
I still do, but I had not done one at the US Supreme Court, and
But I remember, at least I wanted you to argue it, right?
Yeah.
Because I referred you the case.
yes, you did.
And, when I found out that was not gonna happen, I was disappointed.
Yes,
But I remember this so vividly. I was in Cincinnati and you'd gone to DC to do a mock.
yes, we
And,
did.
and Doug, I can't remember,
Howard Dreemeyer.
Howard Dreemeyer, argued it. And you called me afterwards.
Yeah.
And I was like, how's this imposter, doing?
Yeah.
Did he do a good job? And I'll never forget what you said. You were like, he's better than me.
Yeah. He's a better moral advocate.
And I remember asking you, I was like, well, that must make you feel okay about all this. And you were like 100%.
No, I was delighted that we were able to get him on the team. He was a wonderful advocate, and he had been in the Solicitor General's office. He knew how to argue to the US Supreme Court, which is a different animal.
Yeah.
And he did a wonderful job, and our whole side did a wonderful job. And of course, it's clearly a crowning moment for a lawyer to get a case in the US Supreme Court. So I was, and the fact that it came from you made it, it has a lot of things about it that are really wonderful. And so.
Well, and we skipped over this part, but when you were a child, your father argued a case.
My father argued a case in 1962. It was a case involving the rules of civil procedure. It was a complicated jurisdictional dispute, but he had argued in 1962, which I remember. I was a child, but at that time you had to wear a morning coat and striped pants and so forth. And I remember him dressing up in that outfit to go to Washington and do that argument.
So I think, we're at the end of the outline here.
Yeah.
One question that was on the suggested things is a question about, retirement.
Yeah.
And so, I guess we can end with that. And, you and I have obviously talked about this a lot, but, do you plan on retiring?
So I plan on gradually slowing down. And I stopped teaching as part of that plan. But I'm not ready to stop altogether. And
You're still having a good time.
still like what I do, still like my colleagues, still like these unusual cases that I've been lucky enough to get some of. And I'm still getting them. I mean, once you do cases, these sort of public interest cases, people from out of the state call and talk about those cases. And so I've argued some cases.
You've got some voting rights cases.
Yeah,
recently.
voting rights and other kinds of civil rights matters. They're not really, they've not been how I made a living, but they've been a wonderful part of being a lawyer, and
Well,
still got some of those opportunities.
And it goes back to, what the question I asked you earlier about, were you disappointed about not getting that judgeship, 10 or 15 years ago? And I mean,
I wouldn't have gotten to do
you
these
wouldn't have gotten to
things.
do that.
No, I wouldn't have gotten to do these things. And so, like I said, things work out, and
Right.
I'm very happy with how they worked out.
Right. And,
Um,
another, the kind of the final question, I suppose, is, if you could go back and do it all over again, would you?
No. Yes, I mean, would I choose this path? Yes, I would. I got to watch my father have a wonderful time being a lawyer, and have a really, really good life, really intellectual life, and important friends that were meaningful to him. And I've been lucky enough to have the same opportunities, similar opportunities, and you are too.
Yeah.
And so it's been very meaningful. It's been wonderful to be a Nashville lawyer, part of the Nashville bar. Has been great.
Great. Well, I think that's probably
That's good.
all that we have
It's a
to
good
do.
stopping place.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jay.
No, thank you.